3. New struggles in exile. The ambiguous character of the Italian War renewed old antagonisms and brought new confusion into the ranks of the exiles. Whilst the Italian and French fugitives opposed the mixing up of the Italian movement for independence with the coup d'état regime in France, many of the German fugitives were anxious to repeat the folly which had already cost them 10 years of banishment. However, they were very far removed from Lassalle's standpoint and even effusively in favour of the new era, which they believed to have opened up in Germany by the grace of the Prince Regent and in which they hoped to share. As Freiligrath declared contemptuously, they were bubbling over with a desire to be pardoned and were eager to perform any patriotic action if only His Royal Highness would fulfill Kinkel's prophecy before the court-martial in Rastatt and draw the sword to establish German unity. Kinkel once again sprang into the breach and made himself the mouthpiece of this tendency, and on January 1, 1859, he began issuing a weekly publication, Der Hermann, whose antediluvian title immediately betrayed the ideas it preached. To quote Freiligrath again, it immediately became the favorite organ of all those homesick heroes who were trembling with impatience to receive permission to plunge into the barrack square liberalism which now prevailed in Germany, but just for this reason it became very popular, so much so, in fact, that it killed Die Neue Zeit, a little working-class paper issued by Edgar Bauer on behalf of the Workers' Educational League. Die Neue Zeit lived chiefly on the credit granted to it by its printer, and it was naturally lost when Kinkel offered the latter the far more profitable and reliable order for the printing of Der Hermann. However, Kinkel's shabby trick did not meet with unanimous approval even amongst the bourgeois fugitives, and even the Free Trader Fischer formed a finance committee in order to save Die Neue Zeit. These efforts were successful and Die Neue Zeit lived on under the new title of Das Volk, and Elert Biskamp became its editor. Biskamp was a fugitive from the electorate of Hesse and he had contributed to Die Neue Zeit from the provinces, but now he gave up his post as a teacher to devote his whole time to the paper. Shortly afterwards, accompanied by Liebknecht, he visited Marx in an attempt to persuade him to contribute to the paper. Since the dispute in 1850, Marx had maintained no relations with the Workers' Educational League, and he had even expressed disapproval when Liebknecht had afterwards resumed his connections with the League, though Liebknecht's contention that a workers' party without workers was a contradiction in terms had much in its favor. However, it is not difficult to understand that Marx did not succeed in overcoming his unpleasant memories immediately, and he startled a deputation from the League by informing them that he and Engels had received their mandate as representatives of the proletarian party from no one but themselves, and that it had been confirmed by the general and exclusive hatred which all the parties of the old world bore towards them. At first Marx was none too sympathetic towards the request that he should contribute to Das Volk, but he realized that Kinkel could not be permitted to have things all his own way, and therefore he agreed that Liebknecht should assist Biskamp in the editorial work. Although he refused to contribute to a small paper himself, or in fact to any exclusively party paper which was not edited by Engels and himself, however, he promised to assist in the distribution of the paper, to place printed articles from the New York Tribune at its disposal, and to assist the editors with written and oral notes and hints. Writing to Engels, he declared that he regarded Das Volk as a boulevard sheet like the Paris Vorwärts and the Deutsche Brüsseler Zeitung, but still, a time might come when it would be useful to have a London newspaper at their disposal, and Biskamp deserved support because, after all, he was working for nothing. When the boulevard sheet began to make itself a nuisance to Kinkel, Marx was far too much of a fighter not to throw his weight wholeheartedly into the scales on its behalf. He gave a great deal of time and energy in order to keep its head above water, not so much by contributions, for according to his own account they consisted of no more than a few short notes, as by his efforts to provide the means for at least a hand-to-mouth existence for the paper, which appeared in a 4-page edition and a fairly big format. Those few amongst the party members and sympathizers who were able to spare a little money were mobilized, and in particular Engels, who also supported the paper industriously with his pen, writing military technical articles on the Italian War and a valuable criticism of the recently published scientific work of his friend. Although the third and fourth articles of this review were never published, because by the end of August the paper was unable to appear any longer, a most disagreeable practical result of Marx's efforts to keep the paper alive was that the printer, a certain Fidelio Hollinger, made him responsible for the outstanding printing bill. It was an unjust demand, but in view of the fact that the whole Kinkel gang is only waiting for an opportunity to create a public scandal, and because many of the people connected with the paper are not suitable for facing the publicity of the courts, Marx compounded the debt with a payment of £5. Another heritage which Das Volk left him cost him incomparably greater sacrifices and trouble. On the 1st of April, 1859, Karl Voigt, who was living in Geneva, sent a political program for the German democracy towards the Italian war to various German fugitives in London, including Freiligrath, at the same time appealing to them to cooperate in the publication of a new weekly in Switzerland in the spirit of the program. Voigt was a nephew of the brothers Folin, who had played a prominent part in the Burschenschaft movement, and he had been one of the leaders of the left wing in the Frankfurt Assembly together with Robert Blum. In fact, one of the last acts of the dying parliament had been to appoint him one of the 5 Reich regents. When he sent out his political program he was a professor of geology and, together with Fazy, who was the leader of the Geneva radicals, he represented Geneva in the Swiss Diet. Voigt kept his memory alive in Germany by zealous agitation for materialism on the basis of natural science, a very limited form of materialism which went hopelessly wrong immediately it ventured into the historical field. He propagated his opinions with what Rouhet not unjustly termed crude schoolboyishness, and he sought to capture the prurient fancy of the Philistines with cynical phrases. One of his most popular phrases was, "Ideas stand in the same relation to the brain as bile does to the liver or urine to the kidneys." This proved a little too much even for his hitherto staunchest supporter, Ludwig Buchner, who then dissociated himself from this sort of Enlightenment work. Approaching Marx with the idea of obtaining his verdict on Vogt's political program, Freiligrath received the laconic answer, "Tub thumping," but writing to Engels, Marx dealt in somewhat greater detail with the program. Germany abandons its non-German possessions, does not support Austria. French despotism is temporary, Austrian despotism permanent. Both despots are permitted to bleed to death. Armed neutrality for Germany. A revolutionary movement in Germany is not to be thought of in our lifetime, as Voigt is informed from the most reliable source. In consequence, immediately Austria is ruined by Bonaparte. A moderate liberalist nationalist development will begin in the fatherland under the auspices of the Prince Regent, and Voigt may even become court jester. The suspicion that Voigt sympathized with Bonaparte which is indicated in this letter became a certainty when, although he did not issue the proposed weekly, he wrote a number of studies on the European situation which unmistakably demonstrated his intellectual relationship with the Bonapartist slogans. Voigt also sent his program to Karl Blind, a fugitive from Baden who had been friendly with Marx since the revolutionary years and had contributed an article to the Neue Rheinische Review, but had never belonged to the inner circle of Marx's friends and political supporters. In fact, Blind was one of those solemn local patriots and republicans who regarded their own little canton Baden as the center of the universe. They were often lashed by Engels' wit, who found that the opinions of these statesmen usually boiled down, for all their lofty grandeur, into an immense respect for their own persons. Blind now approached Marx and informed him that Voigt was being subsidized by Bonaparte and that he, Blind, could provide proof for these treasonable activities. Voigt had attempted to bribe a South German writer with 30,000 guilders and had also made attempts at bribery in London. In the summer of 1858 a conference had taken place in Geneva between Fazy and his friends and Prince Jerome Bonaparte to discuss the Italian war, and it had been decided that the Russian Grand Duke Constantine should be made King of Hungary. Marx mentioned these revelations to Biscamp when the latter visited him in connection with Das Volk, adding that it was a South German weakness to lay the colors on heavily. Without obtaining Marx's permission, Biscamp used some of Blind's revelations in a satirical article in Das Volk in which the Reich Regent was denounced as a traitor to the Reich, and he sent a copy of the number in which the article appeared to Voigt. The latter answered the attack in the Bieler Handelscourier with a warning to the workers against a clique of fugitives who had formerly been known in Swiss exile under various uncomplimentary names, including the Vagabonds, and which had now gathered in London under its chief Marx in order to hatch conspiracies amongst the German workers, conspiracies which were known from the beginning to the Continental Police and only led the workers into a trap. Marx did not permit this filthy attack to distress him unduly, and he contented himself with holding it up to general contempt in Das Volk. At the beginning of June, Marx went to Manchester to collect funds among friends and sympathizers there for the support of Das Volk. During his absence Liebknecht discovered the galleys of a pamphlet attacking Voigt and containing the revelations made by Blind. The compositor Fugler informed him that the manuscript of the pamphlet had been handed in by Blind himself and that the corrections on the galleys were in Blind's handwriting. A few days later Liebknecht received a copy of the printed pamphlet from the printer Hollinger and he sent it to the Allgemeine Zeitung in Augsburg, whose correspondent he had been for a number of years. In a covering letter he informed the editor that the pamphlet was the work of a reputable German fugitive and its accusations could all be substantiated. The Allgemeine Zeitung published the material and Voigt then sued it for libel, whereupon the paper turned to Liebknecht to obtain the promised proofs. Liebknecht in his turn approached Blind, but the latter declared that the troubles of the Allgemeine Zeitung had nothing to do with him and even denied being the author of the pamphlet, though he was compelled to admit that he had communicated the facts contained in it to Marx and that he himself had published some of them in the Free Press, one of Urquhart's papers. Naturally, Marx bore no responsibility in the matter at all and Liebknecht had quite made up his mind that Marx would disavow him. But the latter thought it his duty to do everything possible to expose Voigt, particularly as the latter had dragged him into the affair quite gratuitously. But even his attempts to extract an admission of authorship from Blind failed owing to the latter's obstinacy, and he had to content himself with a written statement from the compositor Fugler to the effect that the original manuscript had been in Blind's handwriting, which was thoroughly familiar to him, and that the pamphlet had been set up and printed in Hollinger's printing works. Naturally, this proved nothing at all against Voigt. Before the case came up for trial in Augsburg, the Schiller celebrations, planned for the 10th of November, 1859, on the centenary of the great poet's birth, led to a new dispute in the ranks of the London exiles. To quote Lassalle, this day was celebrated by all Germans both at home and abroad as evidence of the cultural unity of the German people and as a joyful promise of national resurrection. Celebrations were also arranged in London and a great meeting was to take place at the Crystal Palace. The proceeds to be devoted to founding a Schiller Memorial Institute with a library and a course of lectures beginning annually on the anniversary of the poet's birth. Unfortunately, however, the Kinkel faction succeeded in getting control of the preparations and it exploited them in the most hateful and petty fashion in its own narrow interests. This group invited an official of the Prussian embassy in London to grace the celebrations by his presence, although the man had earned a very unenviable reputation in the days of the Cologne Communist trial, and at the same time it did its best to keep the proletarian elements amongst the exiles away from the meeting. A certain Betziek, who used the pen name Beta, was Kinkel's chief literary hod-carrier and sang his praises in the most nauseating fashion in Die Gartenlaube whilst at the same time ridiculing the members of the Workers' Educational League, who intended to take part in the celebrations. Under the circumstances, therefore, both Marx and Engels were unpleasantly surprised when Freiligrath consented to be present at the celebrations and to recite a poem after Kinkel had delivered the main speech of the evening. Marx warned his friend against having anything to do with what he termed the Kinkel demonstration, and Freiligrath admitted that he had his own misgivings and that perhaps the celebrations were being exploited to flatter Kinkel's personal vanity, but for all that he thought that as a German poet he could not very well absent himself from the celebrations. And even if the Kinkel people were trying to misuse the affair for their own purposes, that was not the aim of the meeting. However, during the preliminary arrangements a number of peculiar incidents occurred and made Freiligrath feel, despite his deeply rooted antipathy to seeing anything but the best in men and things, and that from the best possible angle, that after all Marx might be right, though he determined to go on with the matter because he thought that he could work against certain intentions better by his presence than his absence. Marx was not in agreement with this and Engels still less so, and the latter gave vent to his feelings in angry words about Freiligrath's poetic vaingloriousness and his officiousness, coupled with sycophancy, although of course this was going much too far. When the Schiller celebration finally took place, it proved to be something more than the usual superficial festivities with which the German Philistine is accustomed to celebrate the memory of the great thinkers and poets who have passed over his nightcap like high-flying cranes, and it found an echo even on the extremist left wing. When Marx complained about Freiligrath to Lassalle, the latter replied, "Perhaps it would have been better had he kept away from the meeting itself, but in any case, he did well to compose the cantata. It was by far the finest thing that appeared in connection with the celebrations. In Zurich Herwe composed a special song for the occasion, and the centenary speech in Paris was delivered by Schiller. In London the Workers' Educational League took part in the meeting at the Crystal Palace after having salved its conscience the day before by a special Robert Blum memorial meeting at which Liebknecht spoke. In Manchester the celebrations were organized by a young poet, Zeeble, who came from the Wuppertal and was a distant relative of Engels, and the latter saw nothing to object to in his activities. Writing to Marx, Engels declared that he had nothing to do with the affair and that Zeeble intended to deliver the oration, the ordinary sort of declamation of course, but quite decent. The fellow is also organizing a performance of Wallenstein's Camp. I was present at 2 of the rehearsals, and if they can summon up sufficient audacity, it ought to go off all right. Later on Engels became president of the Schiller Memorial Institute, which was founded in Manchester in connection with the celebrations there, and Wilhelm Wolff mentioned it in his will for a good round sum. Whilst all this was going on and a certain tension was making itself felt between Marx and Freiligrath, the Augsburg court heard Vogt's action against the Allgemeine Zeitung. It was dismissed with costs against the plaintiff, but the latter's legal defeat developed into a moral victory. The defendants, the editors and publishers of the Allgemeine Zeitung, were unable to bring forward any proof in support of their charges against Voigt, and they contented themselves with a defense which Marx described, all too mildly, as politically unsavory cant. In fact, their attitude was worthy of the severest condemnation, not only politically, but also morally, and its trump card was that the personal honor of a political opponent was fair game. How, inquired the defense, could Bavarian judges give a verdict in favor of a man who had violently attacked the Bavarian government and who was compelled to live abroad owing to his political activities? If the court found against the defendants, the social democratic elements in Germany, who had first sought to put their dreams of freedom into execution 11 years before with the murder of Generals Latour, Gogin and Auerswald, and of Prince Lichnowsky, would burst into shouts of approval. If Voigt succeeded in his action, there would be no reason at all why Klapka, Kossuth, Polsky, Teleki and Mozzini should not appear before the court with equal justification and demand a verdict against their political enemies. Despite the low cunning of this defense, or perhaps just because of it, the judges were impressed. However, their legal consciences were not quite elastic enough to permit them to give a verdict for defendants who had so utterly failed to substantiate their charges. But they were also not vigorous enough to do justice to a man who was hated by the Bavarian government and the Bavarian people. The public prosecutor offered a way out of the quandary, and this the judges seized on eagerly. Under formal pretexts they sent the case for trial by jury, a proceeding which meant absolutely certain defeat for Voigt, because at such a trial no evidence was required to substantiate the truth of the charges against him, and the jurymen were not called upon to advance any reasons for their decision. Voigt did not take up the hopeless challenge, and he is not to be blamed for that. In any case, his situation was not unfavorable, for he could now bask in the sun of double martyrdom. Not only had he been falsely accused and his accusers unable to substantiate their charges against him, but the courts had refused to give him justice. One or two accompanying circumstances even heightened his triumph. For instance, it made a most embarrassing impression on public opinion when a letter from Biscamp to the Allgemeine Zeitung was read in court. Biscamp was really the chief accuser of Voigt, but in this letter he admitted that he had no real proofs for his charges, advanced a few vague suppositions, and concluded by asking the Allgemeine Zeitung whether, in view of the fact that Das Volk was going out of existence, it would care to engage him as a second London correspondent beside Liebknecht. Even after the trial the Allgemeine Zeitung kept up its vague attacks on Voigt, declaring that he had been condemned by his own people, by Marx and by Freiligrath. And everyone knew that Marx was a keener and more profound thinker than Voigt, whilst Freiligrath towered above him as far as political morality was concerned. In the written statement for the defense filed by the editor Kolb, Freiligrath was declared to be a contributor to Das Volk and one of the accusers of Voigt. These statements had been made by Kolb owing to a misunderstanding arising out of one of Liebknecht's letters, in which the latter had not expressed himself any too clearly. When the report of the Allgemeine Zeitung on the trial arrived in London, Freiligrath immediately sent off a short statement to the effect that he had never been a contributor to Das Volk and that his name had been used against Voigt without his knowledge and permission. In view of the fact that Voigt and Fasy were intimate friends and that Freiligrath's employment by the Swiss bank depended on Fasy, disagreeable conclusions were drawn from this action. But they would have been justified only if it had been Freiligrath's duty to come forward openly against Voigt, which was not the case. Freiligrath had nothing whatever to do with the matter, and he was quite entitled to protest against Kolb's attempt to shelter himself behind his name when things began to go wrong. However, the laconic and terse form in which Freiligrath's statement was couched left open the possibility of interpreting it as a disavowal of Marx also. And the latter found it strange that the statement contained not the slightest indication which might have corrected the impression that it was intended as a personal breach with him and a public disavowal of the party. The form of Freiligrath's statement may very well have been due to a certain irritation at the fact that, in the name of the party, Marx had wanted to forbid him publishing a harmless poem in praise of Schiller, whilst he, Freiligrath, was expected to plunge into the breach immediately on behalf of Marx when the latter had begun an unnecessary quarrel. Appearances were made still worse when Blind published a declaration in the Allgemeine Zeitung condemning Vogt's policy unreservedly, but declaring at the same time that it was a deliberate lie to say that he had written the pamphlet against Vogt. The statements of two witnesses were added to his letter. The printer Hollinger declared that the statement of the compositor Fugler that the pamphlet had been written by Blind and printed in Hollinger's works was a malicious invention, whilst a second compositor named We made a statement corroborating Hollinger's evidence. The differences between Marx and Freiligrath were then aggravated by an unfortunate incident. Kinkel's literary hack, Beta, published an article in Die Gartenlaube praising the poet Freiligrath to the sky and ending with a scurrilous attack upon Marx, who was described as a malicious disseminator of poisonous hatred who had robbed Freiligrath of the power of song, of his freedom and of his character. Since he had come into contact with Marx's searing breath, the poet had sung but little. However, after one or two lively exchanges by letter between Marx and Freiligrath, all these things looked as though they would be cleared up and buried with the year 1859. When they were dragged up in the new year by Voigt, who seemed anxious to prove the truth of the old proverb that when a donkey is too well off it insists on venturing over thin ice.